Buenas tardes, hola. I want to say thank you, first of all, to several people, to Domingo García, Professor García, and also to Ramon Finstra for all that you have done to make my visit to Castellón a very busy visit and also a very happy visit. I would like to present to you tonight in just 30 minutes or so a small part of a new history of democracy which Elsa mentioned I have just finished and will be published in Spanish and in English and in other languages this year and early in 2010. And I want to start tonight by concentrating only on the period since 1945, since the end of World War II. And I want to tell you a secret, beginning with the simple thought that the history which is closest to us, the most recent history, is always the most difficult to talk about. Events which are yesterday, the day before, the month before, the year before, their significance, their historical significance, is very difficult to judge. It is, in a way, much easier to speak about the 20th, the 19th, the 18th centuries. And I want to suggest to you that the way that scholars, journalists, and others have been speaking about democracy and the renaissance of democracy since 1945, that the way that has been conventionally spoken about is mistaken. You may know that in the literature there is a lot of talk of liberal democracy, of the return of liberal democracy. This is, for example, the way Francis Fukuyama, the American-Japanese scholar, speaks. Or there is the work of Samuel Huntington, who also American, who died recently, in his so-called third wave of democracy. I don't very much like these terms, and for reasons that I hope will be clear at the end of this public lecture. Because the claim that I want to put to you, the idea that I want to put to you, is that we need to change fairly fundamentally the way we think about democracy in our times. That there is a very major transformation which is going on, so to say, underneath our noses. And that this requires a different way of thinking, a different language for describing democracy. And I have, thanks to Ramon Finstra and others, I have decided to call this new historical form of democracy democracia monitorizada. Monitory democracy, and here you have the roots, at least in several European languages, of this term. It comes from the Latin, from monitoria and monere, to warn. The term itself, monitory democracy, should not be mistaken for monetary democracy. Monetary democracy is money. This is not what I mean. Monitory democracy. It's a term, the term monitoria, monere, is a term, interestingly, that comes to Europe through the church, through the medieval church. A monitory is a letter which someone in the high church, for example, a bishop, sends to another part of the church. A letter, a monitory, a letter is a warning that something is wrong, or that something should be done, or that something should not be done. This is a monitory. And this word, this old meaning of monitory, I would like to introduce to you in this new term, monitory democracy. I would like to say something briefly about the symptoms of what has been going on since 1945. There have been many changes. Remember that in 1945 there were only 12 democracies left. 12 democracies left on the face of the earth. In 1941, only 11. Uruguay makes it 12 in 1945. The restoration of democracy in Uruguay during World War II makes it 12. This was, in other words, a period, 1945, a period when a democracy was endangered, an endangered species, so to say. And since that time, there has been a tremendous revival of interest in democracy and the institutionalization of democracy. And in this respect, I think that there is some truth in the observations of Fukuyama, of Huntington and others, that there has been a tremendous increase in the number of democracies. But I want to suggest to you that the changes that are going on are not describable in the terms that Fukuyama, Huntington and others have proposed. That there are new things that are going on underneath our noses that we have not properly recognized. New ways of handling power, new understandings of democracy, and above all, new institutions of democracy have been created that never before existed in the history of democracy. One example, one clue of, that can suggest the changes is that about 100 new institutions that specialize in the scrutinizing, the monitoring of power, the control of power, about 100 new institutions have been born since 1945 that never existed before in the history of democracy. And among the symptoms of the changes is that the language of democracy has many new terms in our times. For example, stakeholders. For example, high energy democracy. This is a term that Roberto Unga in Brazil has been using. High energy democracy. Stakeholders, participatory governance, communicative democracy, deliberative democracy. According to my way of thinking, these are symptoms of the change. These are names that have been invented to try to describe some of these changes. We are seeing as well a spread of the culture of voting. I'm not sure if you're aware, but for example, in Britain, many more people, young people under 25, vote in game shows, in television shows, than they do for politicians and parties. They MSN, they send online messages, and so on. And the culture of voting is spreading to many institutions. This, I think, is a part of the symptom of what is going on. And I like to say, as you can read in the translation, which was very kindly prepared, that we are moving from a society where the historic struggle was one person, one vote. It was the great political slogan of the 19th and early 20th centuries. The demand by workers, the demand by women and others for the right to vote. We are moving from this era, where more or less this is a settled issue, to another era where the demands are something like one person, many interests, and many votes. If you think about the institutions in which you are voting, or that you have a say, I would say that there is a tendency to multiply citizens' votes so that democracy becomes more than simply elections, parties, parliaments, governments, courts. Democracy comes to mean something more, nothing less than elections, but something more. The scrutinizing, the monitoring of power from other non-electoral, non-party, non-parliamentary institutions. The changes that I'm going to describe to you are not Atlantic or Western only. One of the remarkable things about the emergence of monitory democracy, if I am right, is that many new inventions in the matter of handling and controlling and publicly restraining power, many of the new inventions come from various parts of the world. For example, participatory budgeting, which is one of the new inventions in the era of monetary democracy, is a Brazilian invention. Or, if we take the invention of integrity commissions, integrity bodies. These are an Australian invention. Integrity bodies are bodies outside of Parliament, outside of parties, whose job is to monitor the behaviour of police and to have the power to prosecute the police, for example, for corruption or for wrongdoing. This is an Australian invention, and these have spread to various other countries. In Britain, we do not have yet a monitory body for controlling the behaviour of the police. So if there is a complaint against the police, it is handled initially by the police themselves. This is also, these trends, so this is not just a Western phenomenon, and you can find, as I will mention in a moment, you will find many of these monitory institutions in the new democracies, for example, of India. India has many examples of these power sharing, power constraining institutions. So what have I got in mind? What do I mean by the invention of these new institutions? If I may, it's a little bit boring, just mention several handfuls of these institutions. Citizens' juries, bioregional assemblies, participatory budgeting, focus groups, talkie-okie. I'm not sure if you know what talkie-okie is, as in karaoke. Talkie-okie is when you have live on the internet the filming of an event where people are discussing, deliberating about some local matter, and the broadcast goes live onto the internet for others to watch. It would be possible to turn this lecture into a talkie-okie if you wanted. Public memorials, teach-ins, consensus conferences, citizens' assemblies. I will say something more about them in a moment. Democratic audits, global associations of parliamentarians against corruption, and constitutional safaris. A constitutional safari is when, used in South Africa, the drafters of the constitution go travelling. They go on safari to look at other constitutions around the world. The South African constitution, by the way, contains within it clauses from 8 other constitutions, including the Hungarian constitution. It's something new in the history of democracy. I mentioned that India has many examples of these monitory institutions. Railway courts, public interest litigation, a green bench on the Supreme Court of the Indian High Court. Satyagraha, non-violent resistance to power. This is, of course, a Gandhian invention. I could add to the examples social forums, summits. I will say something about summits in a moment. Public scorecards, the issuing of scorecards publicly to assess the performance of governmental institutions and also non-governmental institutions. International criminal courts, as for example in The Hague. Global social forums of the kind that recently met in Brazil. And the growing trend for many non-governmental organizations, including businesses, to adopt constitutions which specify the way in which power is exercised within those institutions. I will give in a moment the example of the International Olympic Committee. Now, these monitory institutions are these 100 or so monitory institutions, to repeat, never existed before in the history of democracy. When I was trying to write this new history of democracy, I suddenly became aware that it's so obvious that if you take the very long view of the history of inventions in the long history of democracy, going back at least to Greece, you see that the period after 1945 is a very special period. Some things new are going on, and I am trying to find a language for giving a name to this new tendency, and I am trying briefly tonight to say something about how it operates. Let me, if I may, I think I go up or down. Let's see what happens. Up. Oh, is it? Oh, try this one. No? Aha. Okay, let me put this very simply. Our grandparents, our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, when they took an interest in democracy, if they had discussions about democracy, were familiar primarily with this model, if they were lucky to live in countries where there was democracy. Democracy, until 1945, primarily had these qualities. First of all, it was contained within the territorial state. One had democracy in Germany, France, Spain, and so on. It was a system of government whose central organizing principles were periodic elections, multiple parties, the election of representatives to a parliament, and the parliament somehow related to the executive. Could be presidential, it could be prime ministerial system. Citizens operating, living in a civil society have the right to vote for the representative of their party choice, and in this way governments are formed. This is a very simple, of course, model of democracy. One of the things that is going on, I believe, in the world of actually existing democracies, as much in Chile, as in Mexico, as in the European Union, as in India, in Taiwan, in South Africa. One of the changes that is taking place is a change in the political geography, one could say, of the institutions. Please do not misunderstand the... Am I going up or down here? Page up or down?
Down.
Oh, I'm going down. Okay. And we have...
Because it's in 2 times.
Okay. We are moving towards something like this. The blue, you can see, if I may wander here, this is, these are territorial state boundaries. These are the older mechanisms of electoral democracy. But what we have is the growth of monitory institutions, including monitory institutions that operate across borders. And the multiplication of institutions, of sites, where power is subject to scrutiny, to accountability, to monitoring. I would like to say that the changes that are going on in the world of actually existing democracies are complicated, they are confusing, and they are sometimes hard to recognize, and there are certainly misunderstandings, and I would like to mention 6 altogether misunderstandings or possible misunderstandings. First of all, what is going on, I think, is not a return to Athens. That is, we are not living in times where there is something of a return to assembly-based or participatory democracy or popular empowerment. I think Benjamin Barber and others who have made a plea for this to happen, I think descriptively this is misleading. What we are seeing is not the transformation of representative democracy into some kind of popular or some kind of assembly-based direct or grassroots democracy. There are plenty of experiments along these lines, but let me mention that each of these monitory institutions that I have so far mentioned typically rely on representation. And the whole idea of a procurador, the whole idea of a representative is very central to the changes that are going on. Let me mention one example. From Canada, from British Columbia, in fact, comes the example in recent years of the Citizens' Assembly. It's a new method of deciding the allocation of power. And you may know that briefly what happened in British Columbia is that the government, after a lot of pressure, decided to review the electoral system. Normally, this would have been done in the era of representative democracy by the parties, by a parliament, or by an executive. Instead, the British Columbian government decided to establish a citizens' assembly. Through the computer electoral roll, 2 citizens were randomly selected from each of the electorate. They met for 1 year. They were introduced to experts on electoral systems, and the question was, should we change the electoral system for the province of British Columbia? They recommended, in fact, a change, which was subsequently narrowly defeated in a vote, and there will be, this year, 2009, another attempt to change the electoral system from so-called first past the post, the old British system, to some kind of proportional representation. Here's an example, first point, that many of the new monitory institutions depend upon representation. They are not, so to say, based on the originally Greek model of direct face-to-face involvement of citizens. Second possible misconception. Please do not think that elections in provincial or national elections are becoming less important. As we see from the recent American case, elections can be life and death processes. They can alter the balance of power and the whole change of the language and the policies of governments. This is undoubtedly clear, but what is, I think, very interesting about the age of monitory democracy is the growth of many institutions and processes that run parallel to elections, parties, and parliaments. And one example of this is, it's entirely new in the history of democracy, is the invention of election monitoring. Election monitoring. This never existed before in the history of democracy, not in the early 20th and the 19th century. It's in fact a kind of mechanism for publicly scrutinizing the behavior of elections, of parties, of governments, and even, you may know that in the 2004 elections in the United States for the first time, the OSCE monitored the American elections. This is quite a change. The most powerful democracy on the face of the earth is subject to external independent monitoring. It was declared a free and fair election, and the same thing happened in November of 2008. The team of Barack Obama sent, for example, 5,000 lawyers to Florida alone. 5,000 lawyers monitored the election in Florida in the presidential elections. This is a symptom of the kind of change that I'm talking about. So democracy is becoming elections plus, nothing less than elections, but also, in addition, the monitoring, the scrutinizing of power outside of elections. Third misunderstanding, democracy is no longer, I think, describable as merely a governmental affair. That is, if you ask students, if you ask people, what is democracy? Democracy means the election of governments. That's true. But I think that one of the important and unusual, unique trends since 1945 is the spread of the language and the mechanisms of democracy into the domain of sociedad civil, into civil society. You can see this in many examples. For example, the way in which public scrutiny of power is now happening in the condition of children. I mean, the maltreatment of children, discrimination against children. There are now in every democracy networks of organizations whose job is to scrutinize the treatment of children. And some of these networks, we have them certainly in Britain, probably in Spain you have them, are outside the party system. They are outside the parliament. They operate independently. This is true in the field of environment. If you look at the protection of habitats, ecosystems, There are many, many new bodies that never existed before in the history of democracy. And in the field, the cutting-edge field of science, for example, in nanotechnology, for example, in genetically modified crops, in the example of bioethics, we see the proliferation of groups, of networks, of organizations, independent of parties' elections, election cycles, that have the job of scrutinizing and addressing to publics the pros and the cons, the good things and the bad things about proposed policies. This is happening, this spread of democratic mechanisms into the field of civil society is evident as well in some large-scale organizations, some of which operate across state borders. And the example that could be given here is the example of the International Olympic Committee. You know, it has an interesting history from the 19th century. It was, until the 1980s, primarily a gentleman's club. Almost no women involved. And it was run by, I mean, there is a Spanish part of this story. It was run by men who had a lot of free time, very wealthy, many of them aristocratic and having some interest in sport. In the early 1980s, the IOC became caught up in a corruption scandal, thanks to the Los Angeles Times. And it became clear that the IOC was conducting its business usually with a lot of bribery and a lot of unaccountable behavior. And since that time, in the last 25 years, the IOC has become a very different organization. If you Google the IOC, you will see that the structures of the IOC represent something like, or they look something like, a representative democracy. Periodic elections of the president, term limits, the reduction of the age until one can hold a post. It's true that it is still a self-selecting body. But the point is that the IOC has become subject to greater transparency, to a greater accountability in the way it operates. Fourth point, fourth possible misunderstanding. Some people have said that governments are incapable of scrutinizing themselves. We have in English this expression that no turkey would ever vote for Christmas. In fact, it turns out that some of these monitory institutions are examples, there are examples of where governments, for various reasons, decide to set up monitory bodies to scrutinize their own behavior. I think that there are lots of examples. I mentioned, and I repeat only, these police integrity committees. They are very powerful, and they are very important bodies for cultivating trust of citizens in police forces. And they typically operate, for example, in Canada, for example, in some American states, and certainly in Australia, as an important invention that happened within the field of state power. So, in other words, governments decided that police could not be controlled by parties, elections, and parliaments, and that there needed to be another body that would be permanently sitting and that would have the power to scrutinize the operation of the police. Fifth misunderstanding, you know that in the history of representative democracy that existed until 1945, democracy across borders, the whole idea of international democracy is more or less unthinkable. When you speak about democracy, you speak only about democracy within territorial states. I think that empirically, in fact, since 1945, we are seeing the growth of power monitoring institutions that operate across borders. And the example that I would like to give, you can follow some of these lines here, the example I would like to give is the example of summits. I'm not sure if this is easy to translate. Summit is a... Oh, okay. There was always, of course, meetings, high-level meetings between monarchs, between diplomats, for example, in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But the word itself and the practice of publicly scrutinizing the behavior of government representatives across borders is something unique to the post-1945 period. Here, I am not sure if this easily translates, but in English, when we use the word summit, this is an invention of World War II, and according to Winston Churchill, it's a product of the bad or no English of Stalin. The story is this, that in 1943 and 1944, Churchill met Stalin to discuss, in Moscow, to discuss how Europe would look when the Nazis were defeated. And Churchill's idea was that it's good for the most powerful leaders to meet face to face because they could see each other. The body language and so on would help to promote an understanding. The purpose of these meetings, according to Churchill's diaries, was to summarize, to sum up the map of Europe, to sum up. And through the translator, Stalin hears often Churchill saying, summarize, sum it up, and he thinks that the word summit is a description of what they are doing. And Churchill remarks in his diaries, it's a great joke, because Stalin, he didn't know it, invented this word in English, summit, completely on the basis of a complete misunderstanding of what is being discussed. Later, as you know, summits became, for example, in the famous G8 summit, became highly politicized global events. If you look at the G8 summit held in Scotland just several years ago, it was a rock festival. It was also a meeting of high-level G8 officials, many NGOs, many journalists, many and much publicity given. And I think what is interesting is that this is something entirely new in the history of democracy, and it makes possible, it seems to me, it makes possible talk of global democracy or regional democracy or the development of cross-border democracy in a way that was not thinkable in the previous paradigm. Final misunderstanding, and soon I will stop. Some people say that, okay, I can see that there are these many new institutions that greatly complicate the operation, the logic, the dynamism of democracy, but really, when it comes down to it, the most important political actors are elections, parties, governments, executives. They decide basic things. I think that the history of monitory democracy since 1945 suggests that this is not always true. And the example, the most obvious example, and a very inspiring example, is the development of the civil rights movement in the United States. If you look at the history of the civil rights movement, you will see that it is a very good exemplar, a very good example of what I am talking about. Outside the party system, outside of the election cycle, outside of parliamentary institutions, a movement is developed under great difficult circumstances, which invents many new mechanisms. The sit-in. The sit-in, which was used, for example, to target Woolworths, is the idea that if you want to break the pattern where only white people can go to Woolworths to have lunch, then the sit-in is when you occupy, you dress up in a suit, black man or woman, dress up, look smart, go into the restaurant and sit down and leave one seat for someone white to come. The tactic of the sit-in was widely used. It always ended with the police coming and usually people beaten, dragged away and put in prison. There were other techniques. No bail pledges. If you got thrown into jail, you refused to pay the bail, and so you stayed in jail. Sing-ins, the use of church choirs to publicize this action against basically a form of apartheid in the South of America. And the development of all kinds of networked bodies like the SNCC, SNCC, and the Association of Colored Peoples. This civil rights movement, with its monitory institutions, as you know, it's a complicated and very dramatic story, produced some major changes. It produced Martin Luther King. He's a product of this. And one could say that it led to two major legislative changes in the 1960s. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was signed by President Johnson, and the 1965 Voting Act. These legislative changes came from pressure outside the party and election and parliamentary system in the United States. And if you really wanted to push it, you could say that the long-term effect of the civil rights movement was to elect the first black president in the history of the United States. Certainly, Obama is a product of this kind of change. So my suggestion to you is that there are times when monetary institutions have tremendous power effects from below on parties, on governments, on parliaments. Now, I would like to finish by asking a very basic question about why this happened. Why did these changes occur in the world of existing democracy? Why is it that we need a new language in which to analyze, to describe, to think about strategies, and to think about the norms of democracy? Why, in short, did monitory democracy happen? I think that there is no single cause. If you think that this is all an American plot, this is only one part of the story. It's true that the fact that after 1945, one of the major powers, the United States, was a democracy, undoubtedly has had it undoubtedly helps explain some of this. But I want to look at some other reasons. The point is that monetary democracy has no single cause. There are multiple causes. And among the causes is the feeling, I would say, in the period around 1945 to 1950, that democracy quite possibly could disappear from the face of the earth. This was a period, remember, in which the problem of Palestine surfaced. It was a period where India and Pakistan separated with a vicious refugee and violence problem. This was the period of the birth of the Cold War, and this was the period, of course, in which the occupation of Central and Eastern Europe happened. And if you look at this period, you will find many, many observers are depressed about democracy and its future. And you will also find that there are areas where the feeling develops that democracy now will only survive if there are innovations. And I would say that the one key example of this, if you want to look empirically, is the example of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. That document and the politics that went into that document around Eleanor Roosevelt and others is an example of where it's felt that in order for democracy to survive, it has to change. And you can see in this period also many intellectuals. I mentioned some earlier today, Jacques Maritain, Reinhold Niebuhr, and others, who are convinced that democracy now needs to become tougher. It needs to have many more power-controlling mechanisms than under the previous model. But it seems to me that if there is one factor which should give us hope, which should help us better understand why monitory institutions are in many contexts growing and greatly complicating the way democracy works, then there is no doubt in my mind that it is the emergence of a new galaxy of communication media that is very important. Nueva Galaxia. What am I speaking about here? It's very, think of it like this. The age of Greek democracy began in the era of orality, of speech. It was not a literate culture in any predominant sense. That is, assembly democracy sprang up in the age of the spoken word, together with some messages written on stone or papyrus, and messages carried by foot or by donkey. Primarily, the age of classical democracy, in other words, was born in the era of speech, of public speech. The age of representative democracy that began, this is a term from the 18th century and for which there were many struggles during the 19th and the 20th century, the age of representative democracy sprang up in the era of print culture, the invention of the printing press, the rise of the newspaper, the book, the pamphlet. And interestingly, representative democracy collapsed in the 1920s and 1930s with the coming of radio and the very early period of television. Mass broadcasting helped in some cases to kill off representative democracy. You remember the remark of Bertolt Brecht that fascism in Germany would not have been possible without the radio. The question is, if I am right about this development of a new form, historical form of democracy, and if you agree that we could for the moment call it monitory democracy, the question is, what kind of communication system, what kind of media system helps or promotes this trend? I think it's clear that from the 1960s onwards, we have moved and are still moving into an entirely new galaxy of communication media that never existed before. And you know this because you practice this. It is the first time in the history of the human species that text, sound, and image are integrated into a complicated networked system of communications that is global. This is something that I think greatly helps, underpins, shapes the era of monitory democracy. Here, to give you just one illustration, is an image of the internet. It's the year 2000, 2001, developed by a laboratory in California. Never mind the colors, but you will recognize this. It's like a snow crystal. This immensely complicated networked system of linkages between computer-linked linkages across the world. This is the new galaxy of what I call communicative abundance that we have moved into. You could conduct a thought experiment. If tomorrow morning the internet collapsed, satellite broadcasting was somehow technically cut off, if all aeroplane travel was removed, I would say that monitory democracy would not last for more than a week or two or three, perhaps a month. It couldn't function. Most of the organizations, the watchdogs, the monitory institutions that I have been speaking about couldn't function if the communication galaxy of communicative abundance was weakened. One of the things that is greatly interesting for me is to analyze how communication media shape the operation of governmental, legal, and civil society institutions. And there are many things to be said about the long-term impact of this new computer-mediated galaxy of communication. But one of the things for me that's very striking is that the gap, the division between public and private is changing. What I mean by this is that the world of the private, where things are hidden away, where power can be exercised with nobody knowing what is going on, these days this very phenomenon of the privacy of power is beginning to break down. Let me give some examples. In the last year, a government minister, in fact a foreign minister in Finland, resigned after journalists found out that he was sending text messages to a dancer with whom he fell in love. He's married, of course, and he sends her several hundred text messages. Journalists find out about it, it's publicized, he resigns. The private is public. That is, the exercise of power is subject to public discussion, public disputation. Or take the example, which was very prominent in the last American election campaign, of the use of what are called embeds. Someone with a handheld mobile phone or someone with a small Sony camera shoots something, immediately uploads it on to the web, and suddenly the images are everywhere. You may know that at the beginning of the campaign there was a Republican congressman who made a racist remark in a supermarket checkout, I think in North Carolina. So he's at the supermarket and he's checking out and he makes a racist remark. What he didn't realize is that someone was filming him on their mobile phone. That immediately goes, and he had to resign, of course. Life is becoming harder for parties, for politicians, for parliaments, for whole governments. And indeed, you can see that the use of blogs, of user-generated social networking sites, wiki platforms, YouTube, I mean, these are all examples of the way in which power is increasingly being monitored in not only the field of government, but also in the field of civil society. This is an era in which breaking news can, in fact, break governments. The whole logic of this media-saturated society is one in which governments are made nervous, and in which all organizations potentially, including, I understand, Real Madrid, are made nervous by these trends. Stuff happens, events happen, and these are easily publicized in a way that was not possible in the age of our grandparents and great-grandparents. Let me remind you that in the era of the American Revolution, a message from London to Philadelphia took 6 weeks, and another 6 weeks to come back. That is, news took 12 weeks to travel across the Atlantic. This now, of course, happens in a matter of nanoseconds, and this, I think, changes the operation of governmental and non-governmental institutions, and I think it is changing, it is helping to change the whole character, the contours, the qualities of democracy as we know it. In the paper, which I hope you will read tonight before you go to sleep, I speak about the way in which some bodies, some institutions are cleverly taking advantage of these trends. If you look at Human Rights Watch, if you look at Amnesty International, if you look at the Global Accountability Project, I mean, these are initiatives where the operation of government and non-governmental organizations is increasingly done through these new media of communication. Now, I think I better stop. You may think from this lecture that I am thoroughly optimistic. I didn't say anything about the negative trends, about the trends that are blocking, frustrating, weakening this trend towards monetary democracy. But if I am right, we need a new language for understanding a democracy as it actually exists and where it is going. I think, if I am right about this trend towards monetary democracy, it helps to explain many things. For instance, Why is it that membership of political parties is now at an all-time historical low since the 1920s, since the era of universal franchise? The reason, if you ask if you ask young people, many of you, why you are not a member of a political party, they say, because actually I identify much more with Amnesty or Greenpeace or some network or some other body. This, for me, is much more meaningful to give, so to say, my vote to them or my money to them rather than to the Parti Popular or whoever it might be. I think this helps explain why the reputation of politicians is at an all-time low and why governments are finding it increasingly hard to govern without scandals. It is, I think, because of the change in the whole composition, in the contours, in the political geography of democracy. And I wanted to thank you very much, muchas gracias, for your attention. And I would be very glad to hear discussion about this topic. Thank you very much. A little bit longer, but...
Oye, como se ha vuelto a invitar él, y habíamos saltado al principio de la conferencia, es nuestro turno para comentar. Ramón.
Well, John, thanks for your conference. I want to ask you, isn't this monitor democracy, this democracia monitorizada, only an empirical part, or is there a normative part as well in your conception?
I think that, so the question is there something good or something normative about this? And I think, to put it very briefly, that it requires us to change our understanding of democracy, to preserve old meanings but also to change them, so that democracy comes to mean greater equality, equalization of power. It means the public control of power. It means attempts to prevent the abuse of power, not only in the field of government, at home, and not only in the field of intergovernmental relations, as in the European Union, the attempt to find new mechanisms for democratizing the European Union, but also the prevention of abuse of power in the field of civil society. I would say that something like a democratization of democracy is going on. And if I am right, we can no longer think of democracy in the Washington way, in the last 8 years, where democracy is periodic elections, multi-party system, and a parliament with a written constitution. This, I think, is passé. And I think that you can see empirically the trends towards a much more complicated model. And I would say that from the point of view of people who lose, from the point of view of failed policies, from the point of view of abuses of power, this should be welcomed. So one can speak about the democratization of the relationship of human beings to the environment. The abuse of power in the form of, for example, simplification of ecosystems by companies, by governments. Through these trends, one can blow the whistle. One can try to publicize that there is something wrong here. And I think that, on balance, that is a good thing. It means that life becomes complicated, a bit more complicated, and it means that with a lot of information flying around and a lot of controversies, a lot of scandals, sometimes it might seem that our world is becoming more and more decadent. I don't think that. I think we should welcome it because the abuse of power is often an ugly thing. So, short answer is that normatively, on balance, I think this is a good trend. It's another question as to whether this will survive. We can't have silence.
se pensará que no se estoy animando lo suficiente. Well, I can go to. I think that this is. I agree with this description, and I think that it's really good to see as our representative democracy has another age. I mean that we don't forget in the path the good of the representative democracy. At the same time, I see some dangers on this. Make public everything that is private. I mean, this is in some ways, some subjects, this is good. For example, the domination of the women from the men. This is good. That it was a private sphere, and then this is good that come to the public discussion. But there are others that not. I mean, for example, and there are a lot of information about this in this monitoring arena, above all in the political sphere. I mean, for example, the private relationship among the politicians. I don't know if this is really good to the political institution and the political thinking and the civil society. Do you understand that?
I do.
I mean, where is the barrier of how we can manage this good potential, but it could be bad too?
I think it's a very good question, and I think that there are certainly some negative trends that this monitory democracy will have to deal with, and is already partly dealing with. For instance, anybody in this room who was the object of media attention about something private will know that it's hell. That when journalists hunt, when they hunt for a story, it's hell. Your life is ruined. The life of your children, the life of your partner can be ruined. And this means that we have, in the age of monitory democracy, I think, a discussion and some attempts to regulate when privacy should not be destroyed. And it's interesting that we had, for example, in Britain in the last 6 months, a major case which went all the way to the High Court, where the judge, I think very cleverly, in a freedom of, in a privacy case concerning a man who is a very important man in the world of motor racing. Probably you followed the story. But the judge's ruling was that it depends on the context. If the President of the United States, let's say, arranges for plumbers to go and spy on the competitor party in private, this privacy, there is no right to privacy of this President. That is, the Watergate scandal, and by the way, all gate scandals, as we say in English, are now of this kind, that some things that are hidden should be brought out into the light of public. But the judge pointed out that there are also contexts where dignity of the person, where the livelihood of the person, where the sanity of the person and his or her children can be damaged. And so he called upon regulators, lawmakers, and he called upon journalists to exercise greater care in when the private is made public. And I suppose that more or less this is my view. There is no golden rule. If I say the private should be sacrosanct, the private is absolute, then I'm afraid this is an argument that leads heavily against democracy. But if I say everything should be made public, then I would not apply that principle to myself. I would not like you to know everything about me. I have some things to hide, but I would not like this public interrogation of my identity. So, and this is a difficult matter, but it's a balancing act. But I would say that there are some life and death issues where maximum publicity is desirable. For instance, the decision to go to war should not be, according to the old doctrine of raison d'etat, of sovereignty, it should not be, from the point of view of monetary democracy, it should not be a matter for privacy of politicians and generals to decide. We saw in the last decade, we saw an example of this, where the decision to go to war is done secretly and lies are told. Weapons of mass destruction. And unfortunately, American journalists for a time believed it. They didn't attack it. In Europe it was quite different. I think in Spain as much as in Britain. Certainly in Britain there was a strong, and in Germany a strong protest immediately that there was something that smelled fishy about this. So there are some exercises of power that are so consequential. The decision, among them, the decision of a state to go to war and to ruin people's lives, to heap violence on others, that should not be allowed to be made in private, no matter what politicians or governments say. And I think it's interesting, one last comment on this public-private business, that if you look at all of the major changes of policy, all of the major issues that have surfaced since 1945 in democracies, the rebirth of the women's movement, the growth for the first time of green politics, the development of a human rights culture, the renewal of peace, all of these issues came not from governments, not from parties, not from elections, but they came from monetary institutions outside. That is to say, one effect of these monetary institutions was to say matters like the treatment of women, matters like the treatment of environment, matters such as the decision to go to war should not be private. They are a matter for publics to decide. And I think that, in my own case, I welcome this. But I think all the big issues of our generation have come as a consequence of these monetary institutions. And parties learn afterwards that they have to absorb these policies, and then they turn them into laws and they put money towards them and so on. But the genealogy comes from the private into the public. And it might be one way of redefining democracy. Democratization means the process of bringing out into the public exercises of power that were previously private. And I think this is clear in, for example, you can see this in gender questions, you can see this in the politics of childhood. I mean, there are some important things that are going on thanks to these monetary institutions.
Traduce, si nos acostumbramos a... No, es muy breve. ¿No parece una renuncia a hablar de democracia monitorizada, renuncia a la participación, al control, a la decisión política? ¿Puede parecer?
It appears like a renouncement to the participation and the political involvement in the processes and so on. This age of monitoring democracy.
I mean, some of these gracias. Some of these inventions involve direct participation of citizens, no doubt. For example, my local government in inner North London has just developed a program of children's parliaments. They are really dangerous inventions. I mean, if you go, you hear 12, 13, 14-year-old children talking about the things that matter to them. And so far, these are just talk shops. But the idea is to cultivate, to develop a culture of citizenship among young people, to prepare them for the time when they will vote at 18, or now in Austria, 16. And so some of these institutions encourage the involvement of people outside the election party parliamentary system. And I think that's, in terms of democracy, in terms of citizenship, this is a desirable thing. But remember that there are different modes of participation. And one of the implications, the research implications of this Gestalt switch, this shift of paradigm, this shift of perspective that I'm proposing, is that it would force us to think about different ways of involvement in politics broadly understood. For instance, hypothetically, I can choose not to be a member of the Conservative Party or the Labour Party in Britain. But I can choose to be a member, to be a supporting member of Amnesty International. How do I do it? Someone comes to my door and says, "Are you a member?" "No." "Would you like to become a member?" "Okay." "How do I do it?" "Well, if you give us €2 a month, for example, you could do it through your bank, or you could send a check, or then you could become a member." And of course, I don't know the membership figures, but in Britain, over 1 million people are a member of Amnesty. Many more than political parties. Now, what kind of involvement is this? This is not Greek direct face-to-face participation. It is the giving of money, a kind of contract. If I don't like Amnesty, if they make some stupid remark or some stupid policy, then I withdraw my membership. I turn my back on them. So I think that one of the effects of this monetary democracy is to broaden the repertoire, to change the meaning of citizen involvement. It can mean, and often does mean, that one identifies with this monetary organization as a representative of one's views, although you never vote for them. And one of the challenging points is whether unelected representation is democratic. I mean, my view is that we have to stretch the meaning of representation to include unelected representation, because you can be represented in other ways than direct voting and direct involvement. For example, through joining or receiving literature, perhaps attending once a meeting, or simply watching an event, identifying with an event. Those more than 1 billion people who witnessed G8, Live 8, were participating. I'd say participating democratically. They didn't vote for G8. They had no means of voting. They didn't pay money. But they watched with sympathy, with empathy, this global media event whose slogan is "Make Poverty History." I mean, this is something that is special to the age of monetary democracy. And I think that we should have an open mind about this. Of course, when an organization, a monetary organization, abuses its power, then this is a difficulty. And the question is how to prevent the abuse of power. And this is, for instance, one final sentence, there are some initiatives that are going on, like the Global Accountability Project, which specialize in publicizing how bodies like Amnesty behave. Do they have a written constitution? Do they advertise their budget? Do they publicize their budget? Do they publicize jobs? How do they deal with disputes? I think the era of monetary democracy is encouraging and should encourage this. That is to say, even the monetary institutions should be open. They are not gods. We should not believe unconditionally in them. And if we subject public pressure to parties, we should also do that for monetary institutions.
I didn't say you that there are many teachers here from the secondary school and bachelors. And then when you talk about the child in parliament, it's they can understand which kind of arguments the children can choose in this one.
Thank you for your words. I think you are always brilliant. I want to come back to talk about mass media.
Yeah.
We were talking briefly today. We talk about mass media. I'm very worried about mass media because do you really think we can trust in them? Because at the end they are corporations with a private interest, global company who show you what they want. We can trust in this global mass media to be proper, to have a proper democracy. And the other question is, what do you think about the evolution of this mass media? Because I hear you before to talk that mass media, pre-mass media, as we know, are going to disappear. Maybe in the future, in 10 years time.
Print media.
Like New York Times, maybe it's going to be only in the internet and living only with ads. Are you worried about the question? And we really trust in this world?
Yeah. You know that about trust and democracy, it's a very complicated matter, and it reminds me of the saying of Walter Benjamin about trust. He said, it's hard to translate, but he said something like, trust is of course important, and he recommends that however, that there should be mistrust. I mean, a democracy requires mistrust of power. You have to be skeptical about power. And this is a healthy attitude, and he recommended that there should be a mistrust of all agreements between individuals, nations, governments, parties. And he said sarcastically, trust absolutely in IG Farben, arms chemical manufacturer, Nazi Germany, and the Luftwaffe. So trust absolutely in these. I mean, he was making a joke. And the question of media and trust is, of course, very important. I mean, we could have a long discussion about this, and you could give me many examples from Spain and elsewhere in Europe and the world. To put it simply, I think the picture is a very mixed picture. The idea that I wanted to put tonight was this simple idea that there are three ages of democracy: Greek assembly, modern European representative democracy, and now something new. Call it what you like: fish, paella, monetary democracy. And that these three ages of democracy somehow correspond. There is an affinity between different modes of communication. And I think that in the lecture I emphasize mainly the positive things. There are negative trends. We mentioned already the question of the right to privacy. I would say that the negative trends include the following. The concentration of media capital can go too far. And the example that immediately comes to mind is the case of Italy. When you have a governmental leader who owns most of the media and who has the ability to bribe and threaten the judiciary and in effect to run the party system using this media, then this is bad for democracy. And as you know, the Italians have invented videocrazia as a new kind of a term, or teledemocracy. One speaks about teledemocracy in France. I mean, there is this possibility that the new era of communicative abundance leads to the concentration of private capital and ownership that would be, in the end, bad for competition and bad for the pluralization of points of view and monitoring of power. This can happen. I think that the counter-trend is also very clear. It's very difficult to prevent absolute concentration of one single point of view because of the network structure of this galaxy of communication. And in this respect, our times are different than the age of broadcasting, of television and radio. And I think as well that there is one other trend that needs to be talked about. One trend in this age of communicative abundance to publicize things that are really of life and death importance. It happens, and it happens systematically. We were discussing this yesterday, there is this best-selling book that we have in Britain, also in the United States, called Flat Earth News, by a former Guardian journalist, who points out that journalists are overworked, too busy, sometimes uninterested to take care of doing any research. The consequence is they tend to repeat things that governments tell them through a press conference, or that companies tell them. They don't do their homework. And for this reason, there are what he calls media failures. The failure of journalists to report things and to warn publics that there is something wrong, or something fishy, or that this is bullshit, or these are lies. On the other hand, you can see, and maybe I am too optimistic about this, but one of the logics of the age of communicative abundance is the search for what Americans call the blockbuster story, the breaking news story that attracts huge audiences and advertisers. And you may notice that in the world of communicative abundance, we have now a scandal or breaking news or events that attract millions of people, not only within countries but across borders. And they are happening every couple of days. Sometimes every day, something dramatic happens. And journalists have an interest in this. Private media companies have an interest in attracting audiences, because for revenue's sake, for advertising's sake. And curiously, as a colleague of mine, Michael Shudson, has pointed out, he's at Columbia School of Journalism, this is the counter-trend. So there is the Berlusconi tendency, but there is also the media events, scandal, stuff happens tendency. And what is interesting about this second tendency, this development